Get comfortable. Turn the lights down or off and let the room settle around you, because tonight we are going somewhere very quiet, and quiet is the whole point of it. Tonight you are the only person awake inside a sealed vault, not the only person inside. There are others. There are more than 200 of them, arranged in rows, behind doors with small green indicators, breathing about once every several minutes at a body temperature that would kill you outright if you shared it. They are alive in the way a bank vault's contents are safe. They are held. They are accounted for. And not one of them will speak to you, or notice you, or know that you passed by, for the entire length of the shift you are about to work. You are the caretaker. You are awake so that they can keep sleeping. Now, you have seen a cryogenics bay before. I know you have. You have walked into a room like this, with a weapon on your back and a flashlight in your hand. And you have looked down the rows of frosted doors, and the whole thing took you somewhere between 4 and 11 minutes. You read one terminal entry, because there is always one terminal entry, and it told you something clipped and unpleasant about what the company intended. And you nodded at your screen and thought, well, that tracks. Then you took the stairs and went looking for the exit, and the room behind you went back to being scenery. That is the version everyone has. That is Cryo as a set piece. A cold blue corridor you pass through on the way to somewhere with more happening in it. Here is what that version leaves out. Somebody had to keep those pods running. Not for a scene, not for an afternoon. For years. For decades. A machine that holds 200 human bodies at the edge of freezing does not idle politely in the background. It draws power every second of every day. Its coolant loops develop the same problems that any coolant loop develops. It seals age. Its compressors run hot in summer because even underground there is a summer, faintly, transmitted through several hundred feet of rock with a lag of about 3 months. Its filters clog, its gauges drift out of true, and have to be compared against a reference that itself has been sitting in a drawer since before the war. And someone has to walk that. Someone has to read every indicator with their own eyes, because the automated report is a summary, and summaries are where the half-degree problems go to hide. That someone is you, alone. That is what tonight is. Not a tour of the cryo bay. A full working shift inside it, from the moment the lights come up on a schedule you did not set, to the moment they dim again, and you lie down in a room built for exactly one person, with 200 neighbors who will not roll over, or cough, or complain about the noise. I want to be honest with you about why this is worth 2 hours of your evening, because on the surface, it sounds like the least eventful premise imaginable. A person walks down a corridor. A person writes a number on a form. A person eats standing up. A person goes to bed. It is worth it because the emptiness is doing something. When you take the people out of a place that was designed for people, everything the designers actually believed becomes visible. A vault with 300 residents in it looks like a community, and communities are noisy and warm, and they cover up the architecture. Take the residents out. Put them behind doors. Leave one person walking the halls with a clipboard. And suddenly you can see the thing for what it is, which is a filing system with plumbing. That is the sentence I want to leave with you before we begin, and we will come back to it several times tonight, from several different angles until it is properly yours. Cryogenic suspension was not a rescue technology. It was a storage technology. Nobody in the chain of decisions that put those 200 bodies behind those doors was primarily solving the problem of how to save them. They were solving the problem of what to do with them. Those are not the same problem. They produce very similar hardware and completely different paperwork, and it is the paperwork that gives the game away. You are going to read some of that paperwork today, in the afternoon, in a records room with a filing system that is genuinely, impressively good. And you will notice something about it that takes a while to name, and once named cannot be unnoticed. But I am ahead of myself. That is hours away yet. Before we go down, one small thing, and I will keep it short, because nothing wrecks a quiet evening faster than someone asking you for something in a bright voice. If this is your sort of thing, long, slow, no jump scares, no music stings, just a voice walking you through somewhere strange until you stop tracking it and drift off, then subscribing genuinely helps. And if you are still with me at the end, or if you fall asleep at the 20-minute mark and come back tomorrow, which is honestly the compliment I would rather have, tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is where you are. I read those. It is a nice thing, knowing that the same recording is playing in a flat somewhere at 2 in the morning and in a car park on a lunch break at midday. Right, that is done. So, let me set the shape of what is coming so you know what the rhythm of tonight will be, and then you can stop paying attention to me and start paying attention to the corridor. The shift runs a full day, and it is structured, because it has to be. Structure is the only thing a single person has when there is nobody to check their work. You will wake early, because the lights say early. You will wash, using an allowance measured in a way that will surprise you. You will walk the bays, which is the first and most important task of the day, and takes considerably longer than you would expect, because 200 is a lot of doors when you are actually looking at each one properly. Then you will go down to the reactor, which is the other end of the same problem. Every one of those pods is a permanent electrical load, and the thing that answers that load sits several levels below you and gets hotter with every landing. You will do the maintenance you were taught by a recorded voice on a hollow tape, because the person who would have taught you is not available and has not been for a long time. You will eat at midday in a galley built for 100, which is a specific kind of experience. You will spend an hour on the hydroponics deck, where things are growing under lamps on a cycle that has nothing to do with the sun. And I will stop us there for a while, because there is a genuinely interesting question buried in that room, which is, what is money in a place with no second person to trade with? What did the company put in your hands instead of caps? The answer is more revealing than the question sounds. In the afternoon, you will go into the records. In the late afternoon, you will find a storage bay full of crated pre-war stock with the packing slips still legible, and we will talk about the factory those pods came out of, and the people on that assembly line, and what they thought they were building. In the evening, there is a radio bench and a signal that comes and goes with the weather up top, and a door protocol that has not changed since it was written, and is not yours to change. And then, at the end, last rounds. the half-degree pod again, to see what it has done all day. The final numbers in the final log, and a reflection I will offer you honestly rather than sentimentally, about what it means to be extremely good at a job that nobody assigned you personally, in a facility owned by a company that filed you as a role rather than a name. I will tell you now that there is no disaster tonight. Nothing breaks catastrophically. Nobody wakes up. The door does not open. If you are here for an event, there isn't one, and that is not an accident of the writing. It is the truth of the job. The whole purpose of a caretaker is that nothing happens. A shift where something happens is a shift that has already gone wrong somewhere upstream, weeks earlier, in a decision that nobody logged, which means the tension tonight lives entirely in the small things. A number that has drifted. A breaker that has been reset before, more than once, by hands that were not yours. A sound in the ventilation that is fractionally different from the sound in the ventilation yesterday, and the way you notice it without deciding to notice it. Because after enough months down here, the building's noise becomes something you hear the way you hear your own breathing. That is the register of the whole evening. Attention without alarm. Care without company. So, let's put you in it. Picture rock. A great deal of rock, in every direction. Warm and silent, and utterly indifferent. Somewhere inside it. A cavity lined with steel and concrete, arranged over several levels, lit at this hour at about a third of full brightness, because the timer says so. And in a small room, on one of those levels, on a bunk built for one, with a jumpsuit folded on the chair and a logbook on the shelf, and a schedule that has not varied in a very long time, someone is about to wake up. That someone is you. The year is 2230. That number probably means very little on its own, so let us tie it to something you can feel. The bombs fell in the autumn of 2077, on an ordinary October morning, and by the time of tonight's shift that morning is 153 years gone. Nobody alive on the surface above you remembers it. Nobody alive on the surface above you has met anybody who remembers it. The war is not a memory anymore. It is a landscape. Set it against the things you might already know. The sole survivor does not walk out of a cryogenic pod in the Commonwealth for another 57 years after tonight. Diamond City exists up there in some form. A walled town inside a pre-war ballpark, but it is a rougher and smaller thing in this decade than it will become. The Institute is underground, somewhere to the south of you, doing whatever it is doing, and you have never heard the word. The Brotherhood of Steel has not arrived in this part of the world, and will not for 2 more generations. You are sitting in a gap in the story. Nothing famous happens here. That is exactly why it is worth an evening. The place is a vault-tec installation cut into the hills west of Boston, far enough out that the ruins are a suggestion on the horizon rather than a neighbor. It does not have a name you would recognize, and it will not get one from me, because giving it one would invite you to go looking for it, and it would not be there. Call it the vault. That is what the paperwork calls it, in the sections where the number has been left blank for a regional office to fill in later. It goes down 5 levels. The entrance level, with the door and the gear room and the decontamination arch that has not been used in a very long time. Below that, residential, which was built for a population that never quite arrived in the form the plans expected. Below that, the 2 cryogenic bays, which are the reason this vault exists at all. Below those, the utility level, which holds water reclamation, air handling, hydroponics, and the galley, all crowded together in a way that suggests the design was revised late and cheaply. And at the bottom, the reactor. 5 levels, roughly 40,000 square feet of usable floor, and 1 person awake in it. You are the cryogenic caretaker on a single-person waking rotation. That is the job title as it appears on the duty roster, in the small capitals of a pre-war typewriter, on a form that was printed in bulk and shipped out in boxes. Caretaker, cryogenic bays, rotational. There is a line under it for a name. The line on your copy has your handwriting on it, and nothing else. No surname, no personnel number, because the personnel numbering scheme was administered from an office that stopped existing before you were conceived. Here is what the rotation means in practice. The vault's design assumed that at any given time, 1 member of staff would be awake and moving through the facility, while the rest of the staff and all of the residents remained under. That awake person handles the log, the walk of the bays, the reactor check, the water, the filters, the crops, and anything that goes wrong. They do this for a set term. At the end of the term, they wake the next person on the list, hand over the log, and take the vacant pod themselves. That is the theory. The list is long. The theory is elegant. It was drawn up by somebody who had a slide rule and a deadline. The practice is that you have been awake for 11 months, which is longer than the term. And the reason is not dramatic. It is that the wake sequence on the pods in the staff row has been giving intermittent faults for the last 2 rotations. The previous caretaker logged it, escalated it in writing to a regional office that does not answer, and then, at the end of their term, went under anyway, because the alternative was staying up indefinitely, and the schedule said go. You inherited a note about it. The note is careful and unemotional, and ends with the words pending review. So you do not wake anybody, because you cannot reliably wake anybody. And the person who might have authorized an override is asleep in row 2, 40 feet from where you eat. 2 concrete things about your material circumstances, because those tell you more than any amount of atmosphere. The first is what you are wearing. A standard vault jumpsuit, dark blue, yellow stripe down the sleeve and the leg, reinforced at the knee, with the vault's number stitched across the back in figures 4 inches high. On yours, the stitching is there, but the number is the placeholder the manufacturer used on the run, and the correct digits were meant to be embroidered on, at the receiving end, by a machine that either never arrived or was never unpacked. You have 3 of these jumpsuits. 1 on you, 1 in the wash cycle, 1 folded on the chair. They are the same size because the box they came in was 1 size, and the box was allocated by projected population rather than by anybody's measurements. Yours is loose across the shoulders. You have got used to it. You cuff the sleeves. The second is what you eat. Your ration allotment, calculated by the same office that never filled in the vault number, allows you 2,400 calories a day, drawn from a mix of preserved stock and hydroponic yield in a ratio that shifts by season. Preserved stock means tinned and boxed pre-war food, of which this vault received a quantity intended to feed a full complement for a period of yours. and which has therefore lasted one person for a very long time. Hydroponic yield means what actually grows under the lamps on the utility level, which is mostly a tough, pale variety of tato, some greens, and a mutfruit bush that produces unreliably and which you keep alive out of something that is not quite sentiment. The 2,400 figure is not a suggestion. It is what the water reclamation and the food stock and the power budget were balanced against. You could eat more. You do not, because the arithmetic that keeps this place running is not the kind that forgives a habit. And the number that actually defines the job, the one everything else exists to serve, 211. 211 occupied cryogenic pods across 2 bays, arranged in rows of 12 with a service aisle between each pair. Bay 1 holds the residents, the civilian intake, the families and individuals who came down here on a ticket in 2077 and lay down expecting to be woken when somebody said it was safe. Bay 2 holds the staff row, the medical unit, and the remainder of the residents, plus 9 pods that are empty and have always been empty, because 9 of the people who were assigned this vault did not make it to the door in time. 211 doors. 211 small green indicators. 211 faces behind frosted glass, which you have long since stopped looking at directly. Not because it disturbs you, but because looking at them is not a task on the log, and everything you do down here is a task on the log. You know some of them by their readout patterns, rather than their features. There is one in Bay 1, Row 4, that runs a fraction warm, and always has, since before you were awake, according to the record. There is one in Bay 2 whose coolant loop makes a click at the end of its cycle, a small mechanical noise like a knuckle, which you have listened to several thousand times. You are not their guard. You are not their doctor. The word the paperwork uses is caretaker, and the paperwork is exactly right, in the plainest and least romantic sense of the word. You take care of a machine, and the machine has 211 people inside it. Now, what tonight actually holds. The shift begins when the corridor lights step up from their overnight third to their working level, which the timer does at what the vault calls 0600, and what has no relationship to any sunrise. You will wash in a stall with a metered flow. You will dress. You will take the logbook off the shelf. Then the first walk of the bays. Both of them, every row, every door, reading the indicator and the temperature and the coolant pressure on each pod in turn, and writing down anything that has moved. This takes a little under 2 hours if nothing has moved. It takes longer tonight because something has. Mid-morning, you go down to the reactor. Gauges, filters, the coolant lines. There is a breaker on that level that has been reset more times than the log has room to record. And you will look at it, and you will think about it, and you will reset it. Midday, the galley and the hydroponics deck, in that order, because the deck's light cycle overlaps the meal window, and you can do both in one trip down. The afternoon belongs to the records room, which is not on the maintenance schedule at all. You go anyway. There is a reason, and it is not curiosity, or not only. Late afternoon, a storage bay on the entrance level that still holds crated pre-war stock, and something in it you have been putting off. Evening, the radio bench, and the 20 minutes a day you allow yourself with a receiver and an antenna run that goes up through 50 feet of rock to a mast you have never seen. And then the last walk and the last entry and the lights stepping back down to a third. That is the day. It is not eventful. It is not meant to be. Get comfortable. The timer is about to change. Before you take the logbook off the shelf, it is worth understanding what it is you are actually keeping. Here is the thing that almost everyone gets wrong about cryogenic suspension. And it is an easy thing to get wrong because the mistake was built into the sales material on purpose. You assume that the pods are a rescue. You assume the logic runs like this. The world is about to become uninhabitable. The people cannot be saved on the surface, so we will freeze them, and when the surface is habitable again, we will thaw them, and they will walk out into a repaired world with a story to tell. Sleep as a bridge. Sleep as a way of skipping the bad part. That is not what the technology was. That is not what it was designed to do. That is not what the paperwork calls it. And that is not what the pods in your base are doing right now. Cryogenic suspension, as vault-tec deployed it, was a storage technology. Not a rescue. Storage. The distinction sounds like a matter of wording, and it is the whole difference between the world you were taught to picture and the world you are standing in. Think about what a rescue technology requires. A rescue requires a destination. It requires somebody, somewhere in the plan, whose job it is to decide that the danger has passed and to open the doors. It requires a defined condition, a radiation threshold, a date, a signal from a surface team, something written down that says, when this is true, wake them. A rescue is a round trip. It has a return leg. Storage requires none of that. Storage requires only that the thing put away stays intact until somebody wants it. Storage is indifferent to whether anybody ever does. A crate in a warehouse does not have a wake condition. It has a shelf and a label and an inventory number, and it sits there until an instruction arrives, and if no instruction arrives, it sits there indefinitely, and that is not a failure of the warehouse. That is the warehouse working exactly as designed. Your bays are a warehouse. 241 units, temperature-controlled, inventoried, logged daily by a single caretaker on rotation. The units happen to contain people. The system does not care that they contain people. It cares that the temperature holds. You know this because you have read the intake forms, which you are not strictly authorized to do, and which you will read again this afternoon. Every resident in those bays signed a document. The document is 4 pages long, and the operative sentence is on page 3, in a paragraph headed with the word duration. And the sentence reads, in effect, that the resident consents to suspension for an indefinite period, to be terminated upon review by the appropriate authority. Indefinite hold pending review. Now stay with that sentence, because it is the most important sentence in this vault, and it is doing something very quiet and very deliberate. It does not say a year. It does not say 10 years. It does not say when radiation falls below a stated level, or when the regional office confirms surface viability, or when the reactor's projected life reaches its final decade. It says indefinite, and then it says the hold ends upon review. And nowhere, not on page 3, not on page 4, not in the appendices, not in the overseer's standing orders, not in any operational document anywhere in this installation, is the word review defined. Nobody wrote down who conducts it. Nobody wrote down what it consists of. Nobody wrote down what would cause it to happen, or how often, or who could request one, or what a successful review looks like, as opposed to an unsuccessful one. The document creates an obligation and assigns it to nobody. That is not sloppiness. Companies do not accidentally leave the termination clause undefined in a contract that governs 241 people. That is a choice made by somebody with a legal background in an office, at a desk, some afternoon before the war. The clause is undefined because defining it would have created a cost. If review means a board convenes annually, then somebody has to pay for a board forever. If review means a surface survey, somebody has to fund surveys. Every definition attaches a permanent expense to a facility that was, on the balance sheet, already very expensive. Leave it undefined, and the obligation costs nothing at all. It exists on paper, it reassures the person signing, and it never comes due. This is the shape of nearly everything vault-tec built, and it is worth naming plainly, because it is the machinery you work inside. The public purpose and the operational purpose were different documents. The public purpose was survival. The operational purpose was a controlled installation with a defined population, a defined power budget, and a defined set of variables, running for as long as the hardware held. In your case, the variable was cold storage of a human population at scale, over a duration nobody had ever tested, with a minimal staffing model. That minimal staffing model is you. Consider what the alternative would have cost. A properly staffed cryogenics facility. One run the way you would run it if you were designing it for the benefit of the people in the pods. Needs a shift. It needs someone on the reactor and someone on the bays at the same time, because a fault in one place while you are standing in the other is exactly how a facility like this fails. It needs a medical officer, because a pod does not just hold a temperature, it holds a body, and bodies at that temperature require someone who understands what is happening inside them. It needs a second of everything for redundancy, and it needs relief, because a person on continuous duty makes mistakes. And it needs the food and water and air and living space for all of those people, permanently, drawn from the same finite budget as the pods themselves. Say that comes to 12 people. 12 people awake indefinitely in a sealed facility. 12 full ration allocations. 12 people's worth of water reclamation. 12 people's air. 12 people's lighting. 12 people's waste processing. 12 people's worth of everything, running against a reactor that was rated for a certain number of years, and no more. Now say instead, 1. One person awake at a time, on rotation, cycling out of a pod and back into one. 1 ration allocation. 1 person's air. The bays are checked once a day instead of continuously, and the reactor is checked once a day instead of continuously. And if a fault occurs at 3 in the morning, it waits until the walk finds it, and the facility accepts that risk on paper because the paper does not have to live in the corridor. The saving is enormous. It is the difference between a facility that runs for decades and a facility that runs for a great deal longer. And from the desk where that decision was made, it is not even a cruel decision. It is a good one. It extends the life of the installation. It protects the population. Every argument for it is an argument about keeping people alive. That is the part worth sitting with. Nobody in that office was twisting a moustache. The rotation was almost certainly proposed by someone who genuinely believed they were solving a resource problem responsibly. And it was almost certainly approved by someone who thought the same. And the 241 people in your bays are still cold and still intact today because that decision was made. The saving was real. The logic held. It is simply that the logic was written for the installation, and you are not the installation. You are the cost line it was optimized around. And here is the quiet edge of it, the part that took you a while to see. A single caretaker on rotation is not only cheaper, it is also simpler. 12 people awake in a sealed facility form a society. Societies argue. Societies develop opinions about the door and about the review clause and about whether anybody is coming. 12 people can reach a decision together and act on it. One person cannot. One person can only follow the standing orders, because a standing order is the only structure available when there is nobody to consult. You do not know whether that was intended. There is no memorandum in the records room that says it. There would not be. But you have noticed that the design solves two problems at once, and only one of them was ever admitted to. So, what are you, actually, in the machine's own terms? Not a rescuer. Nobody is going to be rescued, because rescue requires an authority to declare the danger over. And that authority is a defined role in a structure that stopped existing a very long time ago. Not a caretaker in the warm sense of the word either, whatever the job title says, because caretaking implies eventual delivery. You care for something until you hand it back. You are the maintenance line on a storage facility. You keep the temperature within tolerance. You keep the reactor turning. You keep the coolant moving, and the seals intact, and the logbook current. And by doing so, you keep 241 people exactly as they were on the day they were put away, which is the only outcome the system was ever actually asking for. And the logbook is the proof of it, not the proof that they are alive. The log has no column for that, because alive is not a variable this facility measures. The log measures temperature, pressure, indicator status, and power draw. 4 numbers per pod per day. That is what the paperwork thinks a person in cold storage is. 4 numbers, holding steady, which is a bleak thing to understand at 7 in the morning, with a metered wash behind you and a 2-hour walk ahead. And it changes nothing about what you are going to do next, because the alternative to keeping the temperature is not keeping the temperature. And you have looked at that alternative honestly once, on a bad night, and put it away. So you take the logbook off the shelf. It is a hard-backed thing, ruled in columns, and it is not the first one. There are others, filled, on the shelf behind it, in handwriting that is not yours. You turn to the first empty line. You write the date the way the standing orders require it, and you write your rotation number, and you sign. You sign because the log requires signing. That is the entire reason. There is no reviewer. There is no regional office to file it with. No auditor coming down the access shaft to check that the columns are complete. The signature line exists because somebody designed a form, and the form has a signature line. And forms are obeyed by the people who use them long after the people who wrote them are gone. And there is something else in it, which you would not say out loud. The log is the one place in this installation where the fact that you were here gets written down. Nobody else will write it. The company did not, so you sign your rotation number in a ruled column, once a day, in a book nobody is coming to read. And then you cap the pen, and you put the book under your arm, and you go and walk the bays. The corridor to the first bay runs downhill. Not steeply, a grade you would not notice if you had not walked it several thousand times, the kind of slope a builder puts in so that spilled coolant goes somewhere specific instead of everywhere. You notice it because your knees notice it. On the way out, easy. On the way back, less so. Behind you, the room you sleep in is already dark again. The lights came up in it an hour ago, and they came up because a timer somewhere in the wall decided they should. You did not set that timer. You have never found it. It is not on any schematic you have access to, and you have looked in the way a person looks for something out of curiosity rather than need. Somewhere in this installation, there is a clock that has never once asked you what time you would like to get up, and it has been right about it for years, and you have come to feel about it roughly the way you would feel about a landlord you have never met. The wash is metered. 90 seconds of warm, then a click, then whatever is left in the line, which is cold. You have learned to do the useful part first. You have also learned that the click is loud, that it carries down the residential spur, and that in a place with no other people in it, a mechanical noise on a schedule starts to function socially. It is not company, but it is a thing that happens on time, and there are days when that is close enough. Then the jumpsuit, which is not new, and has your rotation number stitched at the collar in thread that used to be gold. Then the logbook, which you are carrying under your arm. Then the walk. The first bay is behind a door that opens on a manual handle, because the designers decided, and they were right, that the doors into a cryogenics bay should not depend on the same power that keeps the room cold. You turn the handle. The seal breaks with a soft sound like a jar opening, and the air that comes out at you is a good deal colder than the corridor, and dry enough that you feel it in your throat before you feel it on your skin. The bay is long. The pods are set in 2 rows, facing each other across a walkway wide enough for a maintenance cart, standing upright and slightly reclined, each one about the size and shape of a door laid into a cabinet. They are pale, the color of institutional paint everywhere, and they are frosted along the lower third of the glass in patterns that change with the season on the surface, which is a thing you did not expect and have never entirely stopped finding strange. There is weather outside. You have not seen it in years, but it reaches down through the rock as a variation in how much load the coolant loop is carrying, and the coolant loop expresses that as frost, and so there is, in a locked room under a hill, a kind of shadow of the sky. Every pod carries a small indicator beside the door handle. Green means the internal temperature is inside tolerance. That is the whole of what it means. It does not mean the occupant is well, because the indicator has no opinion about the occupant. It is a thermostat with a light on it. You walk the row. You do not look into the pods. That is not squeamishness exactly. It is that looking into 200 faces is a thing you can only do once, and you did it in your first month, and it took a day and a half. And afterwards you understood something about the job that you had not understood before, which is that the pods are your work, and the people in them are not. If you make the people the work, You will not sleep. So you check the light, and you check the frost line, and you touch the seal with 2 fingers at the top corner where the gasket fails first, and you move on. 204 pods across 3 bays. 40 minutes at a proper pace. More if something wants attention. Here is what you are actually walking past, because the machine deserves describing. A cryogenic pod, in the form these installations used, is not one device. It is 3, stacked into a single cabinet and sold as one. The innermost is the chamber itself, a sealed vessel, roughly coffin proportioned, lined with a foamed insulation about the thickness of your hand, and wrapped outside that in a vacuum jacket. The vacuum is the important part. Heat moves through solids and through air, and if you take away the air, you have taken away most of the argument. Every pod in this room is, at its heart, an extremely serious thermos, built by people who understood that the cheapest way to keep something cold is to stop the warmth from arriving. The second device is the coolant loop. Each pod has a compressor and an exchanger at the base, and a pair of lines running from it into the floor, where they join a trunk that runs the length of the bay and down to the plant. The fluid in those lines is a mixture whose exact composition is printed on a plate riveted inside every access panel in the tone of a company that expected to be selling replacements for a long time. The compressor runs in cycles. It is not running most of the time. When it does run, it makes a low sound at about the pitch of a refrigerator in an empty house, and if you stand in the middle of a bay at the right moment, you can hear 30 of them start within a few seconds of each other, and then stop, and the room is quiet again. The third device is the monitor, a small sealed board behind a plate, watching temperature and pressure and the state of the seal, and reporting to the terminal at the head of the bay in a summary you can read in one pass. It does not, and this took you some time to accept, report anything about the person. There is no medical telemetry. There is no heart rate. The specification did not require it, and so the manufacturer, which was in the business of meeting specifications, did not provide it. Which means the light beside each door is telling you about the box. The whole assembly draws power constantly. That is the thing about cold. Warmth is not a substance that can be kept out permanently. It arrives through the floor, through the mounting brackets, through the coolant lines themselves, slowly and without stopping. And every hour of every year, the pod has to move that heat back out again. A cryogenics bay is not a room where something has been made cold. It is a room where something is being made cold, continuously, at a cost, and has been since before you were born. That cost is the number that governs your entire life down here. It is why the corridor lights run at half. It is why the wash clicks off at 90 seconds. It is why there are 204 pods and one caretaker, and not 204 pods and a staff, because a staff would need light and heat and water and food, and every one of those is drawn from the same budget as the cold. You reach the end of the first row and turn. The frost is thicker down this side, closer to the return line, and there is a place on the floor where a previous caretaker, the handwriting on the shelf presumably, laid down a strip of tape to mark where the condensation pools when the humidity control is behind. The tape has gone brittle. You have not replaced it because you know where the puddle forms, and you are the only person who needs to. Second bay. Same walk. The manual handle here is stiffer, and you have oiled it twice, and it comes back stiff, and you have stopped treating that as a failure and started treating it as a fact. Third bay is where you find it. Pod 118, second row, 11 from the door. The light is green. The frost line is where it should be. But the readout at the head of the bay, when you get to it and pull the summary, has one figure sitting half a degree above the rest of the column. Half a degree is nothing. Half a degree is inside tolerance by a comfortable margin, which is precisely why the light is still green. If you had walked the bay and read only the lights, you would have walked out of here knowing nothing. But you have been reading this column for a long time, and the column is not usually ragged. Every other pod in this room sits within 1/10 of the same number, because they share a trunk and a plant and a load, and they behave like a herd. One animal standing half a step out of the herd is not sick. It is just standing half a step out of the herd, and you would like to know why. The causes in order of how much they would ruin your month. A gasket beginning to pass, which is a morning's work and a spare you have. An exchanger fouling, which is a day's work and a spare you also have. A compressor coming to the end of its life, which is a week's work and a spare you do not have, and which would mean pulling a unit from a pod that is empty. And there are 11 empty pods in this installation, and you have already used 2 of them for parts. Or nothing. A sensor drifting. A board getting old in a room that is hard on boards. That happens, and it happens more than the other 3 combined, and the honest odds are that this is what it is. You do not open anything. You do not chase it today. What you do is write it down. The pod, the bay, the figure, the time, and the ambient in the room when you took it. 1 line, in the ruled column, in the book under your arm. Then you will take the same figure tomorrow, at the same hour, and the day after, and in 4 days you will have a shape instead of a number, and a shape tells you whether it is drifting or whether it is climbing. And those are 2 entirely different problems. That is most of what this work actually is. Not repair. Watching patiently, over long enough, that a half degree becomes a sentence. You cap the pen. You look for a moment at the small green light beside the door of pod 118, which is telling you the truth and telling you almost nothing. Then you close the book, and you go down to the reactor. The stairs down to the reactor level are the only part of this vault that never got a coat of paint. You have wondered about that. Every corridor above has the same pale green enamel over steel, applied thickly, applied twice in places where somebody wanted the seams gone. The stairwell has none of it, bare metal, bare welds, a handrail that was clearly ordered from a different catalogue than everything else. Whoever finished this installation ran out of something on the last week, and what they ran out of was the will to care about a place only maintenance would ever see. You go down 4 landings. The temperature climbs on each one, and it climbs in a way you could set a clock by. The cryo bays hold at a little under 16 degrees, because that is what the pods shed, and what the vault has settled into around them. The first landing is warmer than that. The second is warmer than the first. By the 4th, the air on your face has the quality of a room somebody has been sitting in all night with the door shut, and the sound has changed too. Upstairs the vault hums. Down here it works. There is a difference you can hear. And after enough years, you can hear it well enough that you know, 3 landings up, roughly what you are going to find. Today it sounds ordinary. That is worth something. The reactor room itself is smaller than people imagine, and the reactor is smaller than the room. Most of what you are looking at is not the reactor. It is everything that exists to keep the reactor from being interesting. The shielding, the coolant loop and its pumps, the heat exchangers, the primary and secondary breakers, the bank of gauges on the wall in 2 neat rows, and the enormous grey cabinets of the switchgear that decide which part of the vault gets what. Your training on all of this came from a holotape, not from a person. There was a person, once, at the very start, when the rotation still had more than 1 caretaker awake at a time, and that person trained the next one. And somewhere in the chain, the training became a recording of somebody explaining the procedure into a microphone in a room with a hard echo. You have listened to it perhaps 60 times. You know where he clears his throat. You know the place where he says a number, pauses, and says a different number, and never corrects the first one, so that for 2 years you did it wrong, and nothing happened, and then you worked out from the gauges themselves that it must be the second number, and did it right afterward, and nothing happened then either. That is worth knowing about the technology in this place. Almost none of it is precise. It has margins built into it, generous ones, because the people who designed it assumed it would be operated by somebody tired. You start where the recording tells you to start, which is the gauges, left to right, top row, then bottom. Primary loop pressure, primary loop temperature in and temperature out, and the difference between them, which is the number that actually matters and which is not printed anywhere, so you do it in your head. Secondary loop, the same 3. Filter differential, 2 gauges for the shielding coolant that you have never once seen move. Output at the bus, then the bottom row, which is all electrical and all of which you check against the log. You write down 11 figures. You do this every morning. In 8 years of mornings, 10 of the 11 have never done anything you would call surprising. Here is what makes the 11th interesting, and it is worth slowing down for, because it is the whole argument of this installation. A sealed vault does not have an energy problem in the way a settlement on the surface has an energy problem. It has an energy budget, and the budget was written before anyone moved in by somebody with a table of assumptions on the desk in front of them. So much for lighting. So much for ventilation and air handling, which is more than people expect and never gets cut. So much for water, pumping it, filtering it, heating a fraction of it. So much for the door mechanism, which draws almost nothing, but must always be able to draw it. So much for the galley, the workshops, the medical bay, the hydroponics lamps, and then, in a column of its own, the cryogenics. The cryogenics column is the one that breaks the table. Everything else in a vault is a variable load. Lights go off in a corridor, nobody is walking down. The galley draws when someone cooks and drops to nothing when they do not. The workshop draws for an hour. Hydroponics runs on a cycle you can shift, shorten, or in a bad year, suspend entirely and accept the loss. A vault that is running short can shed a great deal of load by simply doing less, and every overseer manual in the vault-tec catalogue has a section explaining exactly which corridors to darken first, in order with the ones nearest the door at the top of the list. The cryo bays cannot do less. 211 pods hold their temperature, or they do not hold it, and there is no partial version of holding it. The drawer is not large per pod. It is not even particularly large in total, once the bays are cold and stable, and the insulation is doing its job. The hard work was the first 30 hours, generations ago, and everything since has been maintenance of a state already achieved. But it is permanent. It has been permanent since the day the doors sealed. It will be permanent for exactly as long as anyone is asleep in there, and nothing about the routine of this installation has any mechanism whatsoever for making it smaller. So when this vault gets short on power, the shedding order starts at the far end and works inward, and it never reaches the bays. You darken corridors. Then you cut hydroponics lamps to half. Then you stop heating water. Then you shut the workshops. Then, in the worst version, you live in 3 rooms and a stairwell with a lamp you carry, and the bays hold at their number, and the green lights stay green, and you are the variable load. You are, in the design's own terms, the part that flexes. You have never disliked that exactly. It is at least honest about what the installation is for. What you do dislike, on the mornings when you let yourself think about it, is the arithmetic underneath. The reactor in this room was specified for a design life, and the paperwork in the records room states that design life plainly, and it is a shorter figure than the number of years this vault has now been sealed. Not dramatically shorter. The kind of shorter that means the machine is running past its warranty rather than past its limit. The way a well-kept pre-war generator will run for decades past the date some engineer wrote down as a reasonable expectation. Fission plants of this size are stubborn. The fuel is not the constraint. The fuel in a unit like this was never going to be the thing that gave out first. What gives out is everything around it. The pumps, the seals, the boards, the switchgear contacts, the 10,000 ordinary components that were rated for a shorter century than the one they have been asked to work through. Which is why you come down here every morning and write 11 numbers in a book. You move on to the filters. There are 4 in the primary loop, in a row. In housings you can open with a quarter turn if the loop is isolated, and cannot open at all if it is not, which is a piece of design you have come to respect. You check the differential across each, which tells you how hard the water is having to push through, which tells you how loaded the element is. 2 are fine. 1 is beginning to load, and you note the figure and think ahead. At this rate, 4 weeks, maybe 5, and you have 3 spare elements on the shelf and a procedure for cleaning a used one that recovers perhaps 2/3 of it and is worth doing. The coolant lines get walked next, and this is the part of the routine that takes longest and looks like nothing. You walk them, all of them. Every run of pipe you can physically reach, with a hand on the metal where it is safe to put a hand, and an eye on the lagging where it is not. You are looking for wet. That is the entire test. A line that is going to fail spends a long time before that being very slightly damp at a joint, and a very slightly damp joint leaves a mark on the floor, or a stain on the lagging, or a faint pale crust where the water has gone and left behind what it was carrying. You find nothing today? You have found something 4 times in 8 years, and 3 of those were nothing. And one of them was a union that wanted a new gasket and got one. Then the switchgear cabinets and the breaker. There is a breaker on the 3rd cabinet, 2nd row, that trips. It has always tripped. It tripped for the caretaker before you, because the book says so, in handwriting that is not yours, going back further than you have bothered to read. It serves a lighting circuit on the 2nd residential level, a level nobody has lived on since the doors closed, and the fault in it is somewhere in a wall in a corridor that would take a week to open up, and a week to close again for a circuit that lights rooms with nobody in them. Nobody has ever fixed it. Every caretaker has reset it. You open the cabinet. You find it, sitting proud of its neighbors in the way a tripped breaker does, and you push it back in with your thumb, and it holds, and it will hold for somewhere between 9 days and about 6 weeks. There is a column for it in the log. There are hundreds of entries in that column. Somebody, decades ago, ruled that column specially because they recognized that this was going to be a recurring feature of life down here, and that it would be tidier to have a place to put it. You write the date. You close the cabinet. Then you stand for a moment in the warm and the noise, with the book under your arm, listening to a machine that has been running since before anyone alive was born, and which will keep running for as long as somebody comes down these stairs every morning and looks at it. Then you go back up 4 landings into the cool. The stairwell cools as you climb, 1 landing at a time, and by the 4th, you can feel the difference on the backs of your hands. The reactor level runs warm enough that you sweat through a shirt in an hour. The residential levels are held at something vault-tec's documentation calls the standard comfort baseline, which is a degree or 2 cooler than most people would choose for themselves, and which you have read described in a maintenance annex as the most economical temperature at which a population will not complain. That annex is honest in a way the brochures never were. It does not say comfortable. It says will not complain. By the time you reach the galley, the sweat on your neck has gone cold. The galley was built to feed 120 people in 3 sittings. You know the number because it is printed on a laminated card screwed to the wall beside the serving line, along with the sitting times, the queue order by residential level, and a short paragraph about not taking more bread than your allotment. The card is spotless. It has been spotless for a very long time, because nobody has stood in front of it in a queue since the doors sealed. There are 4 long tables with benches bolted to the floor. There is a serving counter with 6 steam wells, 5 of them dry and 1 of them switched off at the wall to save the drawer. There is a dish return with a conveyor that still works, and which you have never once used, because you wash 1 plate at a time in the sink at the end of the counter, and it takes 40 seconds. You cook in the corner of a room that could seat a village. The single-person ration schedule is a genuinely interesting document, and it is worth slowing down for, because it tells you a great deal about how a sealed installation thinks. It is not a menu. It is a subtraction table. Down the left side are the stores by category: grains, preserved protein, fats, dried and tinned fruit, the vitamin supplement, salt. Across the top are intervals. In each box is a figure that represents the maximum a single occupant may draw in that interval, without the stores falling below the projected floor for the remainder of the rotation. Every one of those figures was calculated by someone who never expected to meet you. They were calculated against a projection of how long a caretaker rotation would last, and that projection was made in an office before the war by a person with a slide rule and a set of assumptions about how long any of this was going to be necessary. The assumptions were wrong. The arithmetic was not. The arithmetic simply kept dividing the same original supply by a longer and longer denominator, until the boxes on the schedule reached the numbers you eat by now. Which is to say that your lunch was decided a very long time ago by someone who has been dead for 2 centuries and who was not thinking about lunch. They were thinking about a column in a projection. The preserved stores are the least interesting part of the meal and the most reliable. Vault-tec's tinned goods were manufactured to a specification that assumed nobody would open them for a generation. And the tins have honored that specification with a stubbornness that borders on comedy. The labels have faded to the point where you sort by can shape and by the stamp on the lid. The contents inside are exactly what the stamp says. You have never once opened a tin and found it spoiled. You have opened plenty and found something joyless, grey, and structurally intact. The interesting part of the meal comes from the hydroponics deck, and you go there next, because the schedule permits you a fresh draw today, and because the deck is the only room in the vault that smells like anything other than metal and filtered air. It is 2 levels up and along a corridor with a floor that has been mopped by more caretakers than you can count. And when you open the door, the humidity comes out to meet you like something with an opinion. The deck is 4 rows of shallow troughs under lamp banks, and the lamps are the reason it exists in this form rather than any other. Soil farming underground is a losing proposition. Soil is heavy, it needs volume, it holds pests, it exhausts, and it requires you to shift and replace a material you cannot make. Water culture solves most of that by eliminating the soil entirely and running the roots directly in a nutrient solution that circulates, gets tested, gets corrected, and gets circulated again. What it does not solve is light. Nothing solves light. Underground, every photon a plant receives has to be manufactured, and manufacturing photons costs power. And power is the currency that everything down here is actually denominated in. The lamp banks over these 4 rows draw more than the galley, the laundry, and the entire 2nd residential level's lighting combined. That is not an exaggeration, and you have seen the figure written down. What grows here is not what you would choose. It is what was selected decades before the doors closed by an agronomist working to a brief that read something like, "Identify cultivars with the highest yield of usable calories and vitamin content per watt-hour of illumination, tolerant of a narrow temperature band, harvestable without specialized equipment, and capable of being propagated indefinitely without new stock from outside." That brief produces a very specific and very boring list, leafy greens, because they are almost all edible mass and they grow fast. A small, dense tomato that ripens on a short cycle. Beans. A root crop in a deeper trough at the far end that takes 4 times as long as anything else, and which you plant anyway. because the schedule says the vitamin figures do not close without it. A nutrient cycle here runs about 5 weeks from seedling to harvest for the greens, closer to 11 for the tomatoes, and the better part of 4 months for the roots. You know these numbers the way you know the breaker on the third cabinet. You do not consult them. They are simply how time is shaped. You cut a handful of greens, 3 tomatoes that have been ready since yesterday, and you check the solution level in trough 2, which is running low because trough 2 has a slow weep somewhere in its return line that you have decided to live with. And here is the part of the day that always strikes you as strange when you stop to look at it directly, which you mostly do not. None of this costs anything. Not in the sense that it is free. It costs power, it costs your labor, it costs a portion of a supply that will not be replaced. It costs enormously. But there is no money down here. There has never been money down here. This vault sealed with a population, a store's manifest, and a system of internal accounting that vault-tec designed specifically so that money would not be necessary. And when the population went into the pods, that system did not so much collapse as become theoretical. What vault-tec issued instead was scrip and requisition. The scrip was a printed token, denominated in units the documentation calls credits, issued against your work assignment, and spendable only at the internal commissary for the small category of goods the vault classified as discretionary. Sweets, spare socks, a better pillow, playing cards, things that had no bearing on survival, and therefore could be rationed by desire rather than by need. There is a drawer of the stuff in the commissary office, still bundled, still banded, worth precisely nothing, and never worth much more than that. Everything else, food, water, clothing, medicine, tools, replacement parts, moved by requisition slip. You wrote what you needed, you wrote why, your section head signed it, stores issued it, and the slip went into a file. That is not a market. That is a supply chain with a paper trail. The point was never to price anything. The point was to make certain that every item leaving the stores had a name attached to the decision to remove it, which means the vault economy had exactly one function, and it was not distribution. It was accountability. Somebody, somewhere, wanted to be able to open a file and see who had authorized the removal of the 90th crate of flour. Nobody has signed a slip in a very long time. You still write them. There is a pad in the store's office, and you fill one in every time you draw from the sealed stock, and you write your rotation number in the space for a name, and you countersign your own requisition in the box marked for the section head, which is technically improper, and which you do anyway, because the alternative is a file that stops. You have countersigned yourself several hundred times. The file does not stop. On the surface, the same day's labor would be priced in caps, and it would price well. Somebody who can hold a coolant loop stable, read a gauge honestly, keep water culture producing under lamps, and diagnose a switchgear fault is not a common person out there. A trade caravan would pay for that. A settlement would pay more, and feed you while it thought about it. You have no clear idea what the going rate is, but you have listened to enough of the radio bench to know that skilled maintenance is not something the wasteland is drowning in. You could probably name your price. There is nobody to name it to. There is no counter to put a cap on. The number is real in the sense that arithmetic is real, and entirely without meaning in the sense that it describes an exchange that cannot happen. Value requires a second person. Everything you can do is worth exactly as much as it keeps running, and not one cap more. You take the greens and the tomatoes back down to the galley, and you heat the tin, and you slice the tomatoes onto the plate with the greens beside them. And it is, genuinely, a decent plate of food. Better than most people are eating anywhere within 100 miles of here, and you are aware of that. You eat it standing at the end of the counter. You have tried sitting. There are 4 tables and 80-odd places at them, and every one of those places is empty in a way that a room does not manage when it was built empty. A room built for one is quiet. A room built for 120 and holding one is something else. And it is not that it frightens you, because it does not. It is that sitting down at a bench in it turns a 9-minute meal into a 20-minute meal. And 20 minutes is enough time to start thinking about the shape of the room. So you stand, you eat, you wash the plate in 40 seconds, and you set it on the rack, and the rack holds 1 plate, and you go back to work. The records room is on the 2nd level, off the administrative spur, behind a door that does not lock and never did. Vault-tec's designers seem to have decided that a sealed installation is its own security, and on that narrow point they were correct. There is nobody down here to steal anything. And nothing down here worth stealing except the truth. And the truth in this room is filed alphabetically. You come here most afternoons, not because the rotation demands it. The rotation demands a temperature log, a reactor check, a walk of the bays, and nothing else. But because the afternoon is the long part of the day, and a room with paper in it is better than a corridor without. The archive is 4 rows of steel cabinets, olive green, the drawers still sliding on their runners after all this time because somebody built them properly in a factory that no longer exists. Above them, a shelf of bound intake ledgers. Along the far wall, a terminal that still boots, though its stored records duplicate the paper, and the paper is easier on the eyes. Vault-tec kept everything twice. That habit alone tells you a great deal about the company, and you will come back to it. You pull the drawer marked with the first block of residency numbers, and the runners make the sound they make, and you take out a folder at random, and you sit down on the floor with your back against the cabinet because there is 1 chair in this room, and it faces the terminal, and you would rather face the door. Here is what a resident file contains. An intake form, 2 pages, printed on the heavy stock the company used for anything it expected to keep. A medical clearance, signed by a physician whose practice was somewhere on the surface in a city that is now a shape on a map. A consent page. A photograph, black and white, stapled at the corner, curling. A page of what the form calls suitability notes. And a suspension record. Date of induction, pod assignment, initial core temperature, and then a column of periodic entries in 6 or 7 different hands, thinning as the decades go by, until they become 1 hand, and then they become your hand. That is the whole life. That is the entire documentary trace of a person in this vault. And you are holding it in 1 hand without effort. Let me pull back from the room for a moment, because the shape of the paperwork is the shape of the company, and the company is the reason for every single thing in this building, including you. An overseer, in the standard vault-tec structure, is not the top of anything. That is the first misunderstanding, and it is a natural one, because inside a vault, the overseer is functionally absolute. The office controls the door, the water, the rotations, the discipline, the terminal permissions, the lot. From below, it looks like the summit of the world. It was not designed to be. It was designed to be the lowest link in a chain of authority that ran upward, out of the vault, into a regional structure, and from there into a corporate hierarchy in an office building with parking. Above the overseer sat regional oversight. Above regional sat the division that actually designed and monitored the installations. And above that sat the executives who sold the vaults. And above them the board. And beside all of it, a government contracting relationship that made the whole arrangement possible in the first place. Vault-tec built these places on public money for a public purpose and ran a great many of them for private ones. And the paperwork in this room was generated to satisfy people 4 and 5 levels up who were never going to read it. That is the crucial thing about institutional records. Records are not written for the person in them. They are written for the person auditing the person who wrote them. Every form in this drawer exists because somebody, somewhere up that chain, needed to demonstrate that a procedure had been followed. Not that it had been followed well. Not that it had achieved anything. Followed. The signature line is not there to identify a doctor. It is there to establish that a doctor-shaped requirement was satisfied on a given date. The photograph is not there so anyone can recognize a face. It is there because the intake standard specified a photograph. And above all of it sat a review board. The suspension record, the column of periodic entries, refers in its printed header to periodic review under standing authority, which means somewhere in that corporate structure there was a body whose job it was to decide, at intervals, whether the conditions warranted bringing residents out of suspension. It had a name and a room and probably a quarterly schedule and certainly a minutes format. It has not met in your lifetime. It has not met in the lifetime of the person who trained the person who trained you. Its members died on the surface a very long time ago, in an afternoon that took about 2 hours, and the authority they held did not transfer anywhere, because nobody had written a procedure for the review board ceasing to exist. Procedures cover contingencies. The end of the entity that writes the procedures is not a contingency. It is the thing the procedures assume cannot happen. So the header on the form still says pending review, and the column still expects entries, and you still make them. And the reviewing body is a room in a building that stopped being a building in a single afternoon 2 centuries ago. You are, in a very real administrative sense, filing reports to an address. Come back to the folder in your hands. Read an intake form as a piece of material history, and it tells you more than its author intended, which is what material history usually does. The questions are the interesting part, not the answers. Question 1 asks for name, residency number, and prior address, ordinary. Question 2 asks for occupation and skill classification, with a printed list of categories and boxes to tick. Technical, medical, agricultural, administrative, general labor, and another line that is almost never used, because the form discourages it, by giving it half the space of the boxes. Question 3 asks for dependence, and the space provided for that answer is small. Then it changes. Somewhere around the middle of page 1, the form stops asking about the person and starts asking about the body. Height, mass, blood group, known sensitivities, a grid of prior conditions with yes and no columns, a line for medication currently taken, with a note in small print that certain classes may preclude suitability. Preclude suitability. Sit with that phrase a moment. It is doing a great deal of work, and it is doing it very quietly. It means some people who came to the door with a valid residency were turned away at this table, on this form, because a box was ticked. The form does not say what happened to them next. Forms never do. A form's competence ends exactly at the edge of its own procedure, and that edge is the most honest thing about it. Page 2 is the suitability notes, and this is where the handwriting starts, and this is where you can, occasionally, hear a person. Most of them are 2 lines. Cooperative. Understands the term of the arrangement. Some are 3 or 4. Once in a while, somebody writing at that intake table in the last days before the door shut wrote a full paragraph, and the paragraph is never about suitability. It is about the resident's brother, or a question the resident asked that the form had no box for, or the fact that the resident brought a bag that had to be checked and did not want it checked. Somebody writing at speed, at the end of the world, put down a detail that no procedure asked for. Those are the only sentences in this room that are about anybody, and here is the structural point, the honest one, the one worth staying with, because it is the whole shape of the place. These records are immaculate about the process and silent about the people. You can reconstruct from this drawer the exact induction procedure to the minute. You can tell me the required core temperature at the moment the lid sealed, the interval between medical clearance and induction, the number of signatures required, the retention period for each document class, and the standard for legibility of the resident photograph. All of that is here, precise, cross-referenced, duplicated to the terminal, and preserved perfectly across 200 years by a filing system that was over-engineered by professionals. What you cannot tell me is what a single one of these people was like. Not one. There are 200 and some folders in these cabinets, and they contain, between them, perhaps 40 sentences that describe a human being rather than a procedural step. And 30 of those 40 are accidents, somebody's pen running on past the requirement. That is not an oversight. That is the design, working exactly as intended. A record system built to satisfy an audit will preserve, flawlessly and forever, whatever the audit asks about. And an audit does not ask what somebody was like. It asks whether the box was ticked, and by whom, and on what date, and whether the retention schedule was observed. The company kept everything twice. It kept nothing that mattered even once. You are aware, as you sit on the floor with your back against a cold steel drawer, that this applies to you as well. Your own file is in here. You have looked at it. It contains your rotation assignment, your training completion record, your ration classification, and your quarterly log signatures going back to the year you took over. It is thorough. It is accurate. It runs to 5 pages, and it does not contain one word about you. You close the folder. You square the pages against your knee, out of a habit you did not decide to acquire. You stand, and your knees make their small complaint about the floor. And you slide the folder back into its slot, with the tab facing the same way as all the others, because the tabs face the same way. And that is not nothing. You push the drawer home. The runners take it the last inch by themselves. You leave the terminal off. You leave the chair facing where it was facing. You check without meaning to that the shelf of ledgers is square to the wall, and it is because you checked yesterday. Then you go out and pull the door to behind you, the door that does not lock, and the room goes back to holding 200 perfectly documented strangers in the dark. The storage bay is 2 levels down from the records room, and at the far end of a corridor that nobody had any reason to finish properly. The floor there is bare deck plate rather than tile, and the seams are visible. And there is a section about 4 paces long where the overhead lighting was installed but never wired. So the fixtures sit up there with their covers on, clean, waiting for a circuit that was scheduled for a week that never came. You carry a hand lamp for that stretch. You have carried a hand lamp for that stretch for years, and you have thought about wiring the fixtures yourself perhaps 100 times, and you have not done it, and you know exactly why you have not done it. The wire would have to come from somewhere. Everything here comes from somewhere, and the somewhere is finite, and 4 paces of dark corridor that you cross twice a week is not worth a spool of cable that might be needed for a coolant sensor run in a decade you cannot see the shape of yet. So you walk it dark, and the lamp throws your shadow long ahead of you against the bay door. And then you are through, and the bay's own lights come up when you push the wall switch, 1 bank at a time, with a slow flutter as each row finds itself. It is a big room, bigger than it needs to be, which tells you something all by itself. The crates are stacked 3 high on the left-hand side and 2 high on the right, and there is a wide aisle down the middle, where a loader would have run, back when there was a loader and somebody to drive it. The loader is here. It is against the far wall, with its forks down, and its battery long dead, and a canvas cover over the seat that somebody put there deliberately, folded at the corners, tucked under. Whoever did that expected to come back. The crates are the interesting thing. They are pine, most of them, banded with steel strapping, and they are stenciled on the ends in a heavy blue ink that has not faded because nothing in here has ever seen sun. The stencils give a part designation, a quantity, a destination code, and a date. The dates run from the spring of 2076 through to the autumn of the following year, and then they stop, and the stopping is not marked in any way. There is no final crate. There is just a last one, which is a different thing. The packing slips are still in their envelopes, tacked to the crate ends under a flap of oilcloth. You have read most of them. You read them slowly, the way you read anything down here, because there is no hurry, and because they are one of the few things in this vault that were written by somebody who was not writing about you. A slip is a plain document. It gives a shipper, a carrier, a consignee, a list of contents with a line for each, and a signature block with 3 lines: shipped by, checked by, received by. On the crates in this room, the first 2 lines are filled in, and the third is blank on every single one, because the person who was going to sign for these on arrival was going to sign for them on a day that did not happen the way the schedule expected. here is what is worth slowing down for. And it is the thing that the terminals and the propaganda posters and the whole cheerful blue and yellow face of this place are built to keep you from noticing. A cryogenic pod is not a miracle. It is a manufactured good. Somebody drew it. There was a drawing office with drafting tables and lamps on adjustable arms, and a person sat at one of those tables and worked out the geometry of the door seal, and how thick the gasket had to be, and what the tolerance was on the hinge pin, and whether the coolant line should enter at the base or the side. That person had opinions about it. They probably argued with somebody about the hinge pin. Somebody won that argument, and somebody lost it. And the result is the hinge pin in every pod in this vault, and neither of them ever thought about the losing side of that argument again. Then somebody costed it. A pod has a bill of materials, and every line on that bill has a supplier, and every supplier had a quote. And somebody in a purchasing office compared the quotes and chose. The insulation in your pods is a particular grade because a particular grade came in under a particular number, and that number was arrived at by a person who wanted to be finished by 5. Then it was made, not conjured. Made in a plant, by people on shifts. Somebody ran the press that formed the shell halves. Somebody welded the seam, and somebody else inspected the weld. And there is a stamped inspection mark inside the frame of every pod down here. A small oval with 2 letters and a number in it. And the letters are initials. Somebody's initials. That person stood at a station with a light and a mirror and looked at a weld and decided it was acceptable and put their mark on it. And then did it again. And then again, several hundred times a shift, for however long that job lasted them. You have found the same 3 sets of initials over and over in the bays. One of them appears on nearly half the pods on the second row. Whoever that was, they were fast, or they were senior, or they were the one who did the awkward end of the line where the frames came through crooked. Then it was crated, by hands, with strapping and a stencil and a slip in an oilcloth envelope. Then it was carried by a haulier who was paid by the mile, and who had a route and a schedule and probably a preferred place to stop. None of these people knew what they were making. That is the part that is easy to get wrong, and the wrongness is always in the same direction. It is tempting to imagine that everyone who touched this hardware understood the whole design, saw the shape of it, went home troubled. They did not. A person who welds pod shells welds pod shells. The order comes down as a quantity and a specification and a delivery date. What it is for is somebody else's department, and somebody else's department is on a different floor of a different building in a different state. And the whole point of a company organized the way that company was organized is that no single desk ever has to hold the entire thing at once. That is not an accident of the structure. That is what the structure is for. So the pods came down here in these crates, on this loader, along that corridor, and were uncrated and set in their rows and plumbed into a coolant loop. And the crates were carried back to this bay and stacked 3 high on the left and 2 high on the right, because somebody thought they might be wanted for something later. And now they are the only honest history in the building. The records room describes the process. These crates describe the work. there is one crate in the second row that was opened and never emptied. You do not know why. The strapping was cut, the lid was levered and set aside, and then whatever interruption arrived. Inside are gaskets, individually wrapped, packed in a molded tray, and there is a slip of paper on top of them that is not a packing slip. It is a note, in pencil, in a hand that was moving quickly, and it says that the tray count is short by 2, and that the short count has been reported. That is it. That is the entire document. A short count reported. Somebody's small correct act, preserved for 2 centuries under a hill, because nobody ever came to collect the answer. The thing you kept for yourself came out of the crate beside it, and you did not keep it for any reason you could have defended at the time. It is a small brass instrument, about the length of your hand, with a folding arm and a spirit vial set into the body, and a knurled thumb screw that adjusts the arm through a marked arc. It was packed as a fitter's tool. It exists to check that a pod frame is sitting true in its cradle before the plumbing goes in. That is its entire designed purpose, and it does that job beautifully, and it has not done that job since the last frame was set. You use it to level the galley table. The galley table has a bad leg. It has had a bad leg for as long as you have been here, and you could pack the foot and be done with it. And instead, you have a pre-war precision fitter's level that you set on the tabletop every few months, and you turn the thumb screw, and you shim the leg with folded card until the bubble sits between its lines. Then you put the tool back in your pocket. It lives in your pocket. The brass has gone warm-colored where your thumb rests. Some designer specified that knurling. Some machinist cut it. It is in your pocket now, holding a table steady in a room where one person eats. You put the lid back on the second row crate and set the strapping ends flat so they do not catch anyone crossing the aisle, though nobody crosses the aisle. You do one slow pass along the stacks with the lamp, reading the ends the way you always do, the part numbers and the quantities and the dates and the blank third signature lines. Then you go back to the wall switch and take the light banks down one at a time, and the room goes back in stages, right side, middle, left side, until the only thing lit is the doorway behind you. Out in the corridor, the timer at the junction has changed. You feel it before you look at it, the way you feel a change in the ventilation note. The overhead strip has stepped down from its daytime level to something softer and slightly warmer, which is a setting some engineer chose in an office, because a study said that people underground do better if the light pretends to be evening. You stand under it for a moment with the lamp still burning in your hand, and then you switch the lamp off, because the corridor is lit now, and it is enough. The radio bench is in a room off the third landing that was drawn on the plans as a communications office, which suggests that somebody once expected more than one person to be sitting in it. There are 2 chairs. There is a long steel bench along the inner wall, with cable runs going up into the ceiling, through a grommet that has been sealed and resealed with 3 different compounds over the years, and you can read the repairs like layers in a cliff face. There is a wall clock that stopped a very long time ago at 4:20, and you have never corrected it, partly because you have no way to correct it, and partly because you like that it is wrong in an obvious way. It is honest about being broken. Most of the vault is not. The receiver itself takes up about a third of the bench. It is a heavy grey thing with a hinged front panel and two large tuning dials, one coarse and one fine, and a row of small toggle switches under a strip of engraved label plate. Somebody has stuck a paper tag under the fine dial with a number written on it in pencil, and underneath that, a different hand has written a different number, and underneath that, a third hand, and the third hand is yours. You sit down. The chair is the same steel frame institutional chair as every other chair down here, and the seat pan has a dent in it exactly where you have sat for however many evenings this has been. You put your palm flat on the receiver's case for a second before you switch it on. It is a habit, and you know it is a habit. The case is cold when you touch it, and warm when you leave, and the difference between those two states is most of what happens in this room. The toggle goes over. There is a delay of several seconds while the valves inside come up to temperature, and during that delay, the speaker does nothing at all, and then it begins to make the low, textured, breathing sound that means it is listening to something. Not to anything, to the whole sky at once, which is what an untuned receiver hears. You bring the coarse dial round slowly. Here is something worth slowing down for, because the whole shape of your evening rests on it, and because it is easy to picture this wrongly. There is no telephone line to the surface. There was never going to be one. A vault that can be reached is a vault that can be opened, and the entire engineering premise of the place you live in is that it cannot be opened from outside. Every cable that leaves this installation leaves it for one of two reasons: power sensing or the antenna run. That is all. The antenna run goes up through a bored shaft to a masthead somewhere above you on the hillside, and it is a receiving antenna. It brings things in. It does not send anything out. That choice was made on paper by people who understood exactly what they were choosing. A transmitting mast on a hillside is a beacon. It tells anyone with a receiver of their own that there is something down there with power to spare. And power to spare means a working reactor. And a working reactor means everything else. A silent mast that only listens tells nobody anything. So you can hear the world. The world cannot hear you. Whatever the antenna picks up comes down 200 and some feet of cable, through a lightning gap, through a filter box, into that grey case, and stops there, in a room with one occupant and two chairs. What comes down varies enormously with the weather, and after enough evenings you learn the weather from the receiver rather than the other way round. On a clear, cold night, the band is quiet and orderly, and you can separate one thing from another cleanly. When there is a storm system moving across the region, the whole spectrum fills with a hard, crackling wash that rises and falls, and everything else has to be dug out from underneath it. When there is a rad storm somewhere out there, and there are, the noise takes on a different character altogether, a kind of ringing hiss, and the tuning goes soft and unreliable, and you write the date down and try again tomorrow. Tonight, it is somewhere in between. There is weather, but it is not close. You find the first of the frequencies on your paper tag. There is a carrier there. Just a carrier. A bare tone with no information on it, running steadily the way it has run every evening you have checked it. Something is powered, and something is transmitting, and nothing is being said. You have no idea what it is. Your best guess, and it has been your best guess for years, is that it is an automated station of some kind. A beacon that was set going by someone who then stopped being available to turn it off. It has outlived its instruction. You write down that it is present, and you write down its strength on the meter, which is a small illuminated needle, and tonight the needle sits about where it always sits. You bring the fine dial round. The second frequency has speech on it sometimes, and this is the one you sit forward for. It is not always there. It is not on a schedule that you have been able to work out, and you have tried, and you have 3 pages of attempts at working it out in the back of your log, all of them crossed through. Tonight it is there, faint, and it fades in and out in slow swells, as though something between here and there is moving. You cannot make out whole sentences. You can make out the shape of them, the rhythm, the fact that it is one person speaking rather than several. There is music behind it sometimes, some old recorded thing, the tinny brightness of pre-war orchestration coming through a chain of equipment that has all aged badly at both ends. Then the voice again, going up at the end of a phrase, the way a person does when they are reading out a list. You listen for 11 minutes by the little brass instrument in your pocket, which is not a timepiece, so in fact you listen for 11 minutes by counting, which is a thing you have got very good at. What you take from it is not the words, it is the fact of it. Somewhere above this hillside, tonight, there is a person with power enough to run a transmitter and a reason to talk. That is a considerable amount of information. It means there is an economy up there that can produce a working generator and the fuel or the sun or the water to turn it. It means there is an audience worth speaking to, which means there are settled people in numbers, which means there is food coming from somewhere on a reliable basis, which means agriculture, which means water that can be made clean. You have never seen any of that. You have inferred all of it from the fact that a stranger's voice arrives here in slow swells on an evening with weather in it. And here is the part that the layout of this room keeps putting in front of you. 2 chairs, a door protocol printed on a laminated card and screwed to the wall beside the frame, in the same typeface as every other card in the installation, listing the conditions under which the outer door may be cycled. You know the card without reading it. You read it anyway, most evenings, the way you touch the case of the receiver. The conditions are not complicated. The door may be cycled on the authority of the overseer, following written confirmation from the regional office, subject to review. That is the whole of it. Every clause in that sentence refers to a person or a body, and every one of those persons and bodies is a thing that existed on paper, in a building, in a chain that went up out of this hillside and across a country. And the top of that chain stopped being a going concern before your grandparents were born. So the honest reading of the card is that the door may be cycled on the authority of nobody, following written confirmation from nobody, subject to a review that nobody will conduct. You are not the overseer. You have never been the overseer. Your rotation exists below that line, and was designed to exist below that line, and the whole architecture of the job, the log sheets, the countersign boxes, the requisition slips that go into a tray for collection, assumes that somewhere above you There is a rank that decides things, and a rank above that which decides bigger things. The design of your work is deference. It was drawn that way deliberately, by people who understood that a caretaker who could open the door was not a caretaker, but a decision-maker, and they did not want one of those down here on a single-person rotation. And the strange thing, the thing you have turned over on many evenings in this chair, is that the arrangement still holds. Not because anyone is enforcing it. Nobody is enforcing anything. It holds because you were trained into it, because the card is on the wall, because the log has a line for it, because 200 and some people are asleep 3 levels up, and the door is the only thing between them and everything you cannot see. That is not obedience exactly. It is closer to the reason you shim the table leg. The thing is meant to be level. You are the one who is awake. You reach out and bring the fine dial back to the first frequency, and the carrier is still there, patient, saying nothing. You pull the log across the bench and open it to today. There is a ruled block for this. 4 columns: frequency, time, character, strength. You fill in the first line for the carrier. You fill in the second line for the voice. And in the character column, you write that speech was present, intermittent, with recorded music. And you write down the swell period as best you counted it. Because in 5 years, that number might mean something to someone. And because writing it down is what you do instead of being able to answer it. Then you put the pencil in the gutter of the book and close it. The last thing is the toggle. The receiver is not a large drawer compared to a bay of pods, but it is a drawer, and it runs valves, and valves are consumables, and there is a finite number of hours of valve life in the crate in the storage bay, whether you count them or not. So you switch it off. The speaker cuts. The valves stay warm for a while after, and the case under your palm is warm now, and it will be cold again by morning. You sit for a moment in the quiet with your hand on it, and the corridor light comes in through the doorway at its evening setting, soft and slightly warm, pretending. Then you stand, and you take the lamp, and you go and do the last walk. The corridor at night is not darker than the corridor by day. That is one of the things nobody tells you about a sealed place. There is no night here, only a lighting schedule someone set on a timer board in a room you have opened twice. What changes at the evening setting is the color. The overheads drop a step in brightness and shift a little toward yellow. And the effect is not really darkness at all. It is the suggestion of a lamp left on in a house where everyone else has gone to bed, which, in the only sense that matters, is exactly what it is. You go down the spine corridor with the lamp swinging at your side unlit, because you do not need it yet. You carry it because the last walk includes the bays, and the bays run cooler and dimmer than everywhere else, and there are readouts down there. You have learned to distrust reading by overhead light alone. The first bay door takes both hands. It always has. The seal is good, and the hinge is honest, and the whole assembly was built by people who expected it to be opened by a shift of 4 with a cart, not by one person with a lamp in one hand. So you set the lamp down, get both palms on the bar, and lean. Cold air comes out around your ankles. Inside, the frost has done what it does every evening, which is climb about a hand's width further up the inside face of each pod's window than it stood at noon. this is not a fault. The cycle runs slightly colder on the evening setting, because the vault as a whole draws less then, and the coolant loop is given the slack, and it takes it. You knew that before you knew anything else about this place, because it was the second thing on the second holotape. Still, you look. You always look. You walk the row with the lamp lit now, holding it low, and the light goes along the line of pods, and each window takes a moment of it and gives it back. Green at the door plate. Green at the door plate. Green at the door plate. 200 and some, and you do not count them any more, the way you counted them in the first month. One by one aloud, because counting aloud in here is a thing you stopped doing for reasons you have never written in any log. At the 14th pod on the second row, you stop. This is the one. The readout has sat half a degree high since the morning walk, and it sat half a degree high yesterday, and the day before that it sat a quarter. You crouch and put the lamp on the deck plate and look at the numbers, and then you put your bare hand flat on the housing about a foot below the window, which is the place where the coolant line comes up through the base and turns, and you hold it there and count to 30. Cold. Properly cold. Not as cold as its neighbour, which you check next with the same hand. The same 30, because a hand is a terrible thermometer in isolation, and a decent one in comparison. There is a difference. It is small. It is real. You take out the pencil and the field card, and you write the number off the readout, and the time, and next to it you write that the housing reads cool to the hand, warmer than adjacent by a small margin. No frost deficit at the window. No audible change in the loop. Then you write the thing you have written 3 days running, which is that the trend is upward and slow and worth watching, and that the likely cause is a fouling in the branch line, rather than the pod itself, and that the tool required is not in the storage bay. You underline the last part. You have underlined it before. There is nobody to underline it for. That is the shape of it down here. You are extremely good at this. Not in the way a person says that about themselves to feel better in an empty corridor, but in the flat, measurable way. You can tell a fouled branch from a failing compressor by the sound the loop makes when it cycles. You can read a bank of gauges the way a farmer reads a sky. You know which breaker on the reactor level has a weak spring and needs the reset held for 3 seconds rather than 1. And you know it because you worked it out alone over a season, with a holotape that did not mention it, and a manual that was written for a facility that had 4 of you. You have kept 200 people cold and alive for longer than the people who built this room thought one person could. That is a skill. It is a real one. It took real years, and it cost you real things to learn. And the second half of it, which sits alongside the first, and does not cancel it, and is not cancelled by it, is this. Nobody asked you. Not you specifically, and not anyone in these bays. Somewhere before the bombs, there was an office with good carpet and a window, and in that office, a set of people decided how a facility like this one would be run in the long term. They ran the numbers. They compared a rotating staffed shift against a single waking caretaker with an automated backstop, and the single caretaker came out cheaper on power, cheaper on rations, cheaper on air, cheaper on everything the model measured. And so somebody drew up the rotation, and somebody above them initialed it, and it went into a binder, and the meeting ended, and those people went down in the elevator and drove home and had dinner. That is not a story about monsters. That is worse and more ordinary than that. It is a Tuesday. The forms in the records room are immaculate about that decision. There is a revision number on the rotation schedule. There is a date. There is a note that it supersedes an earlier version. The company that could not be bothered to define what review meant in the phrase indefinite hold pending review could be bothered to log which draft of the caretaker schedule was current in the spring of that year. And in all of it there is not one line about you, not your name, which you have not said aloud in a long time, and which appears nowhere in this facility. Not the 14th pod on the second row. Not the breaker with the weak spring. Not the fact that the tool you need is not in the storage bay and never was, because the packing list for the storage bay was assembled by a procurement office working from a parts schedule for a different model of loop. The records are perfect about the process and silent about the people. That is not an accident of filing. It is what the filing was for. A process that is documented can be defended. A person who is documented is a liability. You put the field card in your breast pocket and pick up the lamp. The rest of the row is green. The next row is green. You do the third bay and the fourth. And in the fourth, you stop for a moment at the near end. Not for any reading, just to stand, because the loop in that bay runs at a slightly lower pitch than the others, and it is the closest thing in this place to a room with someone breathing in it. Then you close the bay doors, both hands leaning, and the cold stays behind the seals where it belongs. Up the spine corridor. The reactor level does not need you again tonight, and you have learned not to go down there out of restlessness, because going down there out of restlessness leads to touching things that do not require touching. At the log desk, you copy the field card into the book in ink, in the ruled columns. The time, and the pod, and the number, and the trend, and the underlined line about the tool. You sign it because the log requires signing. Then you close it and set the pencil in the gutter and square the book to the edge of the desk, which nobody will ever notice, and which you do anyway. The lighting board clicks somewhere behind the wall. The overheads step down again, the last setting of the cycle, and the corridor goes to that low amber that is not quite enough to read by. You stand in it for a while. Through the wall you can hear the coolant loop cycle, the long draw and the settle, the same as it does 200 times a night, the sound of something enormous doing exactly what it was told a very long time ago by people who are gone. In the bays, behind the sealed doors, the frost is climbing its hand's width up the inside of the windows, the way it does every evening, patient and even and blind. And in the room, built for one, you set the lamp down on the floor beside the bunk, where you can reach it, and you lie down with your boots on the way you always do. The hum goes on, the light goes down another step, and holds.